Just by way of introduction, my name is Jim Hayward. I work with the Legal Sustainability Alliance, which is based in the UK, and I'll just do a little bit of a background as to the LSA in just a second. But it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to be with you tonight or today, sorry, um, and to talk a little bit about the carbon calculator, so the LSN, the new carbon calculator, which hopefully you will have had your login details. And if you've got any problems with logins, just drop Mike at LSN a note and he will get in touch with me and we'll sort that out. But if you're anything like me, I always forget my passwords. So don't feel at all embarrassed if you've had it and you can't remember it, or you don't feel you've had any notification. You should all have had, or the main contacts in each of your firms that are registered with LSN will have had your login details. So if you've got without what it is, just drop Mike a note and we'll sort that out. So don't be worried. Don't worry about that. Screen now, and I will just take you through a few slides. I'm hoping that everybody can see that screen. I just need if somebody could tell me that they can see the about the LSA slide.
Yes,
Can just some
yes.
Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm never quite sure because you're never quite saying what you can see. So the Legal Sustainability Alliance, UK based. It's a not-for-profit company registered in the UK, about 140 law firms as members. Most of those firms are international, either with their main headquarters or main offices in the UK, probably London, but not necessarily. A lot of those firms will be firms that you either already work for, have worked for, or you will know about anyway. So you have there's a range of size of firms from the sort of the small to the large. We were first to start, the LSA was first established way back in 2007, so it's been going for a number of years now, and I was involved in the sort of setting it up right at the beginning. The LSA itself has had long experience with really supporting members on a range of different issues around carbon footprinting, setting targets, greenhouse gas reduction in general, and also particularly staff engagement, which we recognize as a really important part of what you're trying to do. Cutting carbon, obviously, it's something that it requires everybody really to be involved and be committed in one way or another. So that's one of the things the LSA has done and continues to do. Number of resources, and you can see the LSA's website if you just Google Legal Sustainability Alliance. A number of resources there are available, obviously to members, but there are some other resources available as well. And I think as we go through, and as the relationship between the LSA and LSN develops and continues to develop, I'm sure there'll be other resources which usually share, which will be really helpful. In the UK, we're very closely affiliated with the UK's Bar and other legal support organisations and initiatives. But again, that's not restricted exclusively to the UK, but that's one of the things that we are developing as a wider engagement with the whole legal community. And we've had a pretty long relationship with the US and the Australian support network. So Law Firm Sustainability Network as it was in the USA, and then Oz LSA in Australia. So we're really delighted to be supporting LSN via the access to the calculator. What I thought I might do, and forgive me if this is really, you know all this already. So, but I just thought in order to make sure we're all kind of on the same page, it might be helpful just to do a very quick kind of sense check as to, what are we talking about. So when we talk about carbon, it is really the shorthand for a combination of greenhouse gases, as you'll know, each of which contribute in one way or another to global warming. The main source, obviously, of those greenhouse gases and the ones that we're particularly concerned about are associated with the burning of fossil fuels, so oil, coal, gas, etc., which to provide energy in the form of heat or light or power. And about 75% of greenhouse gas emissions come from burning of fossil fuels and 90% of CO2 emissions. And we're talking a little bit about the difference between gases, but again, so forgive me, I'm sure you know these things. But most activities generate more than one type of greenhouse gas, and sometimes that can be confusing because we generally tend to talk about carbon dioxide or CO2, but what we're talking about is the whole basket of greenhouse gases. And in order to sort of make accounting for greenhouse gases a little bit simpler, we use the expression CO2 equivalent or CO2e. to relate the carbon impact of all the greenhouse gases back to the impact of carbon dioxide. So when you see the results from the carbon calculator, it'll be given to you in TCO2e, which is tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So just to explain that, because I know in some cases people are not quite sure what the E relates to, and essentially it's about saying, in order to avoid us having to keep a tally or an account of every single one of the greenhouse gases and the impact that they have, we lump it all back to the equivalent impact that carbon dioxide has. So obviously carbon dioxide itself is a one-to-one. Talk about things like methane, is about 21 times the impact of a unit of carbon dioxide. And when you get to things like hydrofluorocarbons, things that used to be used, particularly in refrigerant plant, still are used, but less and less potent refrigerant gases are now being used. But if you think about the HFCs or hydrofluorocarbons, they can be up to 125,000 times the impact of a unit of carbon dioxide. So that's why we need to try to relate all of these back to carbon dioxide, just to make things easier or more or clearer. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about CO2e. So what do we do that produces carbon? Again, I mean, you will know this, but obviously using energy to heat, to light, to power the office, anything that we buy in terms of goods, including food and drink, or any services that we buy in to run the business, each of which has their own carbon impact. And those services might be internal services like catering or cleaning services or security, but it could also be external, things like running a conference or other sort of meeting. Legal services that we buy in. So, if you're buying in, using attorneys independently, insurance, financial, etc., all of those things will have a carbon impact. Obviously, the key ones that we're very familiar with, I'm sure, is things like business travel, flying, driving, which includes taking a cab or a bus, taking the train. All of those burn fuel and use energy. And in the case of flying, particularly, there are other sources of greenhouse gases as well as the fuel used in to power the aircraft. Commuting to and from the office obviously burns fuel, and working from home increasingly, as we've seen through the pandemic, when more and more people were working or have been working from home. I'm not quite sure where you are at the moment in the USA with regard to getting people back into work, but the trend now actually is very much more and more people are going back into work here in the UK, and we're being required to go back into work. But there is still a lot of flexible working where people are taking advantage of the opportunity to work from home, and that has a carbon impact, and we do need to take account of that as well. Trash, getting rid of various types of business waste, which requires obviously energy to treat. And there are obviously also the gas, the trash itself will emit greenhouse gases in different ways. Using water, both producing the water and getting rid of wastewater. Last but probably not, it's not really least, but staying in hotels, it's not a big deal, but it is something we do need to take account of, particularly depending on where you're staying. If you're staying in a hotel in, say, in the UAE or Dubai or somewhere like that, huge carbon footprint compared with, say, in the States or the UK or France, Germany, etc. So that does need to be taken into account of. It's not going to be a major issue, I think, for most people, but there are three basic scopes of carbon emissions, and this is if you're not familiar already with the greenhouse gas reporting protocol, greenhouse gas protocol for corporate reporting. This is, if you like, essentially it's the Bible for greenhouse gas reporting and accounting. And they identify three scopes. Scope one are the direct emissions from things that you own or control. So things like heating equipment, boilers, refrigeration plant, air conditioning plant, etc. Any vehicles that you might own and put fuel into. Then scope two are the indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, particularly from electricity that you buy. But it also could also be heat or cooling that you buy, say, from a landlord if you're a tenant in an office, or from a managing agent. So that's a scope two emission. And then scope three is this very large tranche of between 80 to 95% for most professional services firms. It's the emissions are associated with things that you don't directly control, but that occur as a result of you doing business. So it's essentially in your value chain. or the value chain of the firm. So things like business travel, any purchases you make, waste generated, the things that we mentioned on that previous slide, a lot of those are Scope 3 emissions. And they're the ones that tend to be really, really difficult to get hold of or get the information for, because we're not used to counting the emissions, and we're not necessarily used to getting the data that we need in order to calculate the carbon associated with Scope 3. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second when we talk about the calculator itself. So how do we calculate carbon? Very simply, basically the amount of carbon that's released by a particular source. So for example, the electricity that we might buy is essentially it's the amount of that source. So in the case of electricity, it's kilowatt hours, and we'll talk a little bit about units in a minute, because I recognize that in the USA you may be used to using imperial measurements for things like energy, so BTU, or for example, or pounds of gas, or whatever. I'm afraid you may have to we're having to constrain you to use metric, but we'll talk about how to go about doing the conversion in a short while. But it's the amount of that source. So for example, in terms of electricity, the kilowatt hours multiplied by an emission factor, which is usually expressed as kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per unit, or so in the case of electricity, per kilowatt hour. In the case of, say, water, it might be per cubic meter or per liter. The emission factors are available from a variety of different sources. The UK government particularly produces a comprehensive set for all Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which is updated annually. It's those emission factors that we've used for the calculator, except for electricity. So we have used the US emission factor for electricity in the LSN calculator, but I'm afraid, or not afraid, but we use the UK emission factors for everything else. They should be very close to what's happening in the USA. But obviously, as and when we can get better information and we can get emission factors specific to the USA for your circumstances, obviously we can adjust. But at the moment, that's where we're at. So a very simple example there of if we used 100,000 kilowatt hours of electricity in a year or in the reporting period, multiply it by the emission factor, which in the case of the USA is given there, and then we get we do the math, and there's the result. And again, we tend to represent carbon in terms of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and obviously a ton is 1,000 kilograms. So what I thought we'd do there is I'm going to just stop, maybe just stop sharing for a second and go on to screen. Has anybody got any questions at this stage? I'm very happy to answer any questions people may have, or we can dive straight into looking at the calculator. Okay, there's a silence, so I'm assuming everybody's happy. But do say if you wonder if you've got any questions as you go through, do say. So let's go back to sharing screen, and let's go to the calculator itself. So here we're now live on the calculator. You should have had a login with the user ID and a password. Again, if you haven't had it or you've lost it, if you're like me, you will have lost it, because I tend to forget my passwords. And sometimes a system-generated password is horrendous, and you think, well, I can know where I'm going to remember that. But if you've got a problem, just let Mike know, and we'll sort you out. So don't feel embarrassed if you can't find it. But you'll get a user ID and password. Once you log in, you'll get this. You'll get the introduction, and then it'll obviously gives you an opportunity to find. You can get in touch with LSN if you've got any questions, and then you can hit the calculate your carbon emissions button in order to start. What I thought I would do is we'll go on to one of the previous calculations that I've entered in here in order to. So this is what if you hit the calculate button, this is what you'll get to. So the first thing you need to do is to put in a date range. We would recommend that you use certainly an annual carbon footprint is really useful, but you can do this on a quarter by quarter basis or a month by month basis. And that's quite useful, because you think, well, what we find really helpful is just to get an understanding of how things are changing on a quarter by quarter, particularly as the seasons change. You might be using more energy, people might be traveling in a different way, or so on, or you might have some circumstances where you want to sort of capture the data for a different period rather than the year. But certainly, as a minimum, we would say do it for a full year footprint. You can either do it as a calendar year or you could do it in line with your own reporting period, which might be a financial year or any other period. So put in a start date and an end date. And then you need to put in a little bit of information, obviously your first name and surname. Now you can use this as you like, really. You can either put your own name in there, or if you wanted to do this for a number of different offices, you could put the office name in there. So you don't have to, you can split this if you like, in terms of if you felt you wanted to have a carbon footprint for a number of your own locations, and you can identify this by putting something into the first and surname. So it doesn't have to be your name or a person's name. The firm name will come up. I mean, I'm registered as me, but it will come up as your firm name. The office is covered by the footprint and the total floor area and the head count. We do use that in order just to be able to provide a metric, a relative metric at the end. So you'll see a carbon figure per square meter or per FTE, full-time equivalent members of staff. So that's useful for your own comparison and also sort of like for like. There is a little box down here which says I consent to the data being used in my organization's carbon report, which is my organization being LSN. At the moment, I don't know what the plans are, but if you tick that box or check that box, it gives Mike and others the opportunity to use your data as put together a report. What we do with the LSA is it's anonymized, so it's not a name and shame exercise. You don't have to check that box, but if you do, it just means it's easier in the long run to better use the information. And it may be helpful for you because it may help you to benchmark or to receive a benchmark of how other members of LSN are doing. So once you've done that, you go on to step 3, which is the data entry. Now, a few words here, and what I would say is, well, there's a guide note we put together, which everything I'm talking about now hopefully is included in the guide as well. As it's a PDF guide, and it's a series of screenshots with some information on each one, which will help you to sort of navigate your way around. But just briefly at the top, calculate carbon emissions is, as it suggests, you can start a new calculation if you wish to. You can go to previous calculations. Anything that you've done previously and entered, you can go back to and you can edit at any time. So if you feel you want to do something in draft, you haven't got all the information, you can just do it that way and go back to it and add in new information or change stuff that that's data that that's improved, etc. Obviously, if you want to go back to the LSN's website, you can do so, or you can log out. At the bottom of each page, sorry, I'm going to quickly go down to the bottom. You can save the draft as you go through. Once you've entered data, we'll show you in a second. You update the calculation, and I'll take you to a report, which will be a graphical report. Or you can go back. So I mean, it's the normal sort of navigation that you'd expect on this sort of thing. So hopefully, it's nothing too complicated there. Each of the aspects or each of the emission sources will have a little sort of, if you like, a did you know box here. Now, we've tried to make this as useful as possible and as relevant to your situation in the USA as possible. Obviously, there may be some things in here which will be particularly helpful for your colleagues. Some might be quite general, but some of the things, as far as we can, we've tried to tailor it for your use, as it were. So it's something that you might want to use as a way of having a discussion with folks in order to engage them if you feel that's helpful. So it may or may not be useful to you. Also, where we're asking for particular units, so things like energy, we're asking for kilowatt hours, or the calculator asks you to input it in kilowatt hours. Now, you may not have that. You may have your electricity in BTU or metric million units of BTU, but there's a conversion there. And unfortunately, it does mean that you have to do the math to make that conversion. And likewise with natural gas or fuel oil. So it may be that you get gallons of fuel oil as opposed to kilowatt hours, etc. we have put together a spreadsheet. I'll show you that in a second. Hopefully that will make it easy, because all you need to do with that spreadsheet is to plug the number in that you've got, and hopefully it'll give you the kilowatt hours equivalent. So I've entered some data there. As you can see, I mean, we won't go through exactly what the data is, but it's just the fact is we've entered data, and as you go through, that's what the calculator asks you to do that. There is a little checkbox here which says electricity from certified 100% renewable source. In other words, you're buying your electricity exclusively from solar or from hydro hydro or from wind generation. The reason for having that is because you'll see that if we check that box and when we look at the result, if you're buying your electricity from 100% renewable, using the so-called market-based calculation approach, then the carbon associated with that electricity is zero. The other approach is called the location-based, and so there are differences in the way in which that's portrayed. If you're using location-based, it means that you're using the grid average carbon emission factor for electricity. If you're using market-based, it means you're using the emission factor specific to the electricity you're buying. So if it is 100% renewable, then it'll be zero. When you report, and I apologize that this may be sounding a little bit complicated, but when you report your figures, the best practice is, or good practice, that's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol says you should really do, is to report both market-based and location-based figures, if that makes sense. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail when we look at the results, but just so that you know what that box is about. So it asks you to put in electricity purchase, any gas that you consume. This is direct gas. So if you own a heating plant, for example, or some sort of boiler, or some sort of system on site for heating, and you buy your own gas, and that's where that needs to go in there. And by gas, we're talking about natural gas, or as opposed to petroleum or gasoline. Any indirect gas, so this is gas that's used by a third party. So for example, it might be a landlord. If a landlord provides you with heat, then that's regarded as indirect gas. It still produces carbon dioxide or CO2 or greenhouse gases, but it gets accounted for in a slightly different way. As we said, it becomes a scope 2 carbon emission. Bit of a nuance, probably not very, very important, but just in terms of your reporting, it may prove to be important to be able to differentiate between what you're directly responsible for and what you're indirectly responsible for. And any fuel oil, so for example, you might have a generator, emergency generator or something like that. So any fuel oil burnt on site needs to be put in there. Each of these little fields has got a little button, a little eye icon. If you click on it, as I've done here, it'll help you, hopefully give you some useful information. In this case, it's telling you, what this relates to, and that a gallon relates to so many BTU. A gallon of heating oil relates to so many BTUs. Unfortunately, what you've still got to do then is to convert it into kilowatt hours, but at least it gives you some pointers there. And actually up here in the conversion, it also gives you directly that a gallon is related to so many kilowatt hours. Refrigerants. Now, if you've got refrigerant plants, so aircon plant, then they'll be using some sort of refrigerant gas, and in all probability there will be leaks, and it's assumed that there will be leakage, even if it's tiny, from any air conditioning plant. If you're having that maintained on a regular basis, which I'm sure you would be, then whoever's doing the maintenance will be able to say what recharge they've had to, i.e. how much gas have they had to put back into the system to top it up. And they should keep a record of that for you, and they should also give you, certainly in the UK it's the case, so forgive me, I'm not sure whether it is the case in the USA, but they should probably give you the CO2 equivalent of any gas that's leaked. So you should be able to put that in there. And there are methods to work that out, or methods to estimate that, but you may not have that information. So if on first use of this you think, well, just don't have that, well, leave it blank. But it is worth remembering that if you do operate your own aircon plant, then it's worth trying to get an understanding how much gas has leaked out, and therefore what the greenhouse gas contribution is. Business travel by land. So this is talking about obviously road vehicles, whether it be cars, whether it be cabs, whether it be rail, etc. We haven't included motorbikes in here, which probably should do, but motorbikes are going to be a relatively small, relatively few people are probably going to be doing a lot of business travel by motorbike, and the contribution of motorbikes is going to be relatively small compared with cars, but that is something which I'm conscious is not in here. So we're asking you to put it in kilometers, I'm afraid. So if you've got mileage, then you do need to do that conversion of miles to kilometer. And it's really the best estimate you can. You may not have the information to hand because people don't generally tend to record the mileage that they do. They probably record what they're charging for or claiming back on expenses. But as far as you can, try and get that information. Again, if you hover over the hover over the little icon, it will give you some hints. So the average cost of fuel in the USA is per mile is well, if you say the average of 29 cents per mile traveled by car, if that's the only information you got, i.e. you only got expenses data, use that. Now, obviously, these things are averages, and that may be out. I don't think it's miles out, but it's worth having that if you don't have any other information. I won't go through each of these, but there will be some information on each of these. So similar to rail, there is a if you've only got expenses, then use 15 cents per mile and so on. So, but do best endeavors really to get as much information as you can and fill this in as far as comprehensively as you can. Then business travel by air, again, recognizing that not everybody will know the kilometers traveled or the distance traveled. If you know the number of flights, you can check the little radar button there, put the number of flights in. If you do know the kilometers, if you've got a travel provider who can tell you that, then great. But if you only know the number of flights, put that one in. If you do number of flights, do remember that's what you're putting in here. So in this case, I put 12,000. Obviously, that relates to kilometers. Not 12,000 flights. So you've got to remember that which one of these you've pressed or you've selected. And we've broken it down into domestic, so domestic US, within the US, short haul, and long haul, and also broken it down into cabin class. That does make a difference because each aircraft has a carbon associated with it, and it's divided amongst the passengers, and the passenger density obviously makes a difference. So if you're traveling in first class, your carbon is going to be significantly higher than if you're traveling in economy. And likewise, even in premium economy, it's going to be higher than in economy, and business is going to be higher than, premium economy. So just be aware of that. And if you can get that breakdown, great. You may not be able to do that, but if you can, then do if you're able to. Obviously, if you don't know the cabin class, then you can put the information in this box here. And we'll see what the result is in a minute when we press the button of 12,000 kilometers domestic, 13,000 short haul, and 130,000 long haul. Then staff working from home and commuting, there isn't any really easy way of getting this information other than kind of running through some sort of an algorithm or using some sort of a method to work this one out. In the UK, particularly, we reckon it's about 0.67 tons of carbon equivalent, CO2 equivalent, per person per year working full time from home, if that makes sense. That's using the UK's average domestic energy usage and the UK carbon emission factors. So forgive me, I don't think I've got, we haven't got a figure for the USA, I'm afraid. And it could range. I mean, the figure could range from 0.1 of a ton of carbon to over a ton of carbon per person, or even more than that, depending on the type of property they live in, their lifestyle, etc. Because obviously, every time somebody's working from home, they're using power, they're using heating, they're using lighting, using cooling. So it will be different. So I'm sorry that we can't offer you massive amount of help on that one. It's something that you may have to sort of do a little bit more investigation. But I'm sure at some point in the future, there's an opportunity for some discussion around that. And carbon for staff commutes. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. I just want to make sure I'm not missing chats. Right, so I'll come back to the chat in just a second. So sorry, there was a couple of questions there which I haven't clocked. So I'll come back to that in a second. The carbon associated with staff commuting, again, something you may need to gather through some sort of staff survey or some other means. And it's really a question of asking people, how do they travel to and from the office, and then working through the carbon associated with that. So that's also quite a challenging one. But if you can get the information, then great. Quite often it's done through staff survey. And that's probably the way most firms, certainly in the UK, will do it. But there are other methods of estimating that. So that's maybe something that's going to be difficult. Let me just go back to the question we have. So we've got a question about how do we handle scenarios where electricity or heat or natural gas not metered, lease space in a building. Okay. I think that's a challenging one, and you may need, well, it's a discussion you need to have with your landlord or with the agent you're leasing from. Um, you'll obviously be getting some sort of, you're paying somewhere either through a service charge or some way in which you're getting paid. And it may be a question of that you have to ask, what's the total bill and what's our breakdown in terms of floor space or head count or some other metric, some other way of working out what your relative proportion of that is. And I do recognize it's not the easiest thing to do. I think we have the good fortune in certainly in the UK where there's a requirement for anybody, even a tenant, has to have a meter for their particular use, as well as the shared services which the landlord will pay for. But individual tenants will have a meter. So we're very fortunate in that regard. You're not necessarily in that situation. So I'm afraid it's a question really of having to ask a question of your landlord or the letting agent to see whether you can work out something. If you can't, then you may need to look at doing some research into what's the average energy consumption for businesses of your size. Again, forgive me, I've got that sort of information for the UK, but it would be pointless trying to give it to you for the USA because obviously your circumstances are different.
Yeah, and Jim, this is Brooke who asked
Yeah,
the question.
yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a fair number of leases for our firm over the years, and a lot of them don't actually provide any kind of meeting. In the US, it is pretty
No,
common for the building just to provide heat and cooling without any further information. It's just built into
yeah,
your pricing, for example. So, different places will be different. So that is kind of a challenging. And what we often have seen in other LCAs that, our clients do is a square footage analysis. So, office space emissions factor per square foot that account for
sure,
sort of
sure.
heating and cooling. I don't know if there's anything in here that enables that because doing a square footage kind of analysis on an emissions factor is, arguably less accurate, but also might be necessary for a number of folks who are not able to get this data really.
Yeah, but it's a good question, and unfortunately, there isn't an easy answer to that one. And I think it may be just one of those situations where you'll have to do some estimates, and initially anyway, until such time as you may be able to get more accurate information. But I think so. That's not a very helpful answer, other than saying that I recognise it's a challenge. The What I would say though is far better to estimate using and making some assumptions which are reasonable assumptions, keeping a very clear record of what those assumptions are, so that when imagine this like a financial audit. If somebody comes and says, "Well, how did you reach that number?" Then you've got it recorded as we've done it on this basis, and obviously, and then subsequent years or subsequent periods, you may be able to then improve on it and realize that your figures have changed because you're using a different set of assumptions. But and it's not very helpful, I'm afraid, other than saying I realize it is a challenge. But and even if you then look at average per square foot or per whatever energy consumption for typical businesses and use that's better than leaving a blank in that space. Does that make sense? The second question, renewable energy credits addressed, not specifically, no, because it comes back to this renewable, again, the slight challenge with using renewable energy credits is that you're not necessarily buying, or the electricity that you're using isn't necessarily from a renewable source, although you are getting credit because people, they're buying, the energy company is buying credits on the market from renewable generators, and that's something that happens all the time. Certainly in the UK, green tariffs tend to be backed by guarantees of renewable electricity guarantees of origin or any other type of credit type of arrangement. And strictly speaking, that we try to discourage that being used. Sorry, I'm trying to word this carefully. There's nothing wrong with it. It's completely legal and it's completely understandable that people will buy into a green tariff that's backed by that type of credit or those sorts of guarantees of origin. But in some respects, it's not actually helping the situation if we're not actually we're not funding more renewable electricity. So we're trying to encourage certainly LSA firms to to look very carefully at the type of tariff that they've got and to encourage them to buy their electricity from generators who are actually funding renewable electricity rather than offsetting their oil or gas fired electricity generation through some sort of credits or some sort of offset scheme. So short answer is no, I'm afraid it's not actually addressed specifically. So the energy that you use, even if you do, if they are backed by energy credits, that would you still need to put in the total energy that's used. If you feel that you're actually, that you're comfortable that it is, that the renewable aspect has been looked after and that you are genuinely, you feel that you are on a 100% renewable tariff, then check that box. But all that will do is just zero your carbon associated with the electricity, but you still need to report both the location and the market-based approach, as I was saying. If you're going to do this transparently and as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol suggests you should do, and I think it's what most people would expect. Again, that may not be a very clear response, but hopefully that's helpful. I'll move on because I'm conscious of time, but also I don't want to stop people asking questions because it's really helpful. But it may be that once you sort of start using the calculator, you may have further, it will give you more experience and more questions, I guess. So it may be that at some point we need a sort of a bit of a follow-up session in order to sort of answer some of those questions if we can. I mentioned hotel stay again, it's not a big deal. So I don't want to sort of make this sort of say, well, this is a really, really important part of it. But it is, if you can capture, it's great. The difference between US hotel nights and non-US, and for non-US, we've used an average of sort of hotels in other parts of the world. But as it says in the little box here, Saudi Arabia, if you stay there, 7 times the carbon associated with an average US hotel. So there is a big difference. It's unless you're staying thousands and thousands of nights, or your colleagues are, the figure isn't going to be huge, but it's still there. And I think it also just helps as part of the engagement process. It may be helpful for people to understand that the choices you make in terms of business travel and business stays, etc., can make a difference to your firm's carbon footprint, or will make a difference to your firm's carbon footprint. That said, you are constrained, and if somebody is doing business somewhere in the world where there is only one real option to stay, or one safe option to stay, or one option that's going to help them to do business, then that's where they have to stay. But I think it's worth just highlighting that there is a carbon associated with everything that we do. Trash, waste, what call it what you will, whatever, I think as far as you possibly can, try to get the information to complete this. Again, I know it's very difficult because you don't necessarily have a manifest which will tell you how much trash is being taken away, and it may be that this is all handled centrally by by the landlord or who you're leasing from. But again, and it's something that some people will do a very simple audit, say over a week, just to see how much trash is being disposed of in the different categories. Things like yeah, so I mean, I think that's probably the easiest thing to say there. There's not much. Yeah, I mean, it's fine to say that you can get information from your waste disposal company or whoever hauls your waste, but you may not have that information because it may not be you that sets the contract for that. But again, it's one of these things that your best endeavors to try and get some information in here. If you can get it, then there's a place to put the various types of waste. So things like electronic equipment, or the sort of waste electrical electronic equipment, IT related waste. I mean, those are going to be quite large carbon contributors compared with sort of just general waste, for example. Well, certainly incinerated waste will be lower. Landfill waste is going to have a higher contributor. But if you're getting rid of a lot of electrical equipment, then that will be, or hazardous waste, for example, then that will have quite a high carbon footprint. So just be aware of that. And then water and resources. Really, this is about everything that you buy and water that you may use. Mains water, so we're not talking about bottled water here. We're talking about mains water, and we're talking about things like paper, glass. If you're buying lots of bottled water in glass bottled water, then that would go under there. Food and drink, plastic, etc. So again, best endeavors to try and get a handle on this. What I know a lot of LSA members do is just to do an average over a week or a month, and use that as their annual figure, or pro rata it for their annual figure. So a lot of this is about best endeavors, making some assumptions, keeping a record of those assumptions, and then perhaps looking to try and improve. If you feel that, it's an unusually high, you've got rid of an unusually large amount of waste or trash in a particular period, then obviously, keep a record of that. But most often you're going to be fairly steady throughout the year. Unless there's something strange happening, you're moving offices or you've taken on some new facilities or whatever. But again, I keep stressing it's sort of best endeavors to fill this information in, not trying to get an absolutely down to the last couple of decimal points sort of figures, but trying to get as best information you can in there. Last two categories, data centers and cloud services. As it says there, about 2% of the world's CO2 emissions come from data centers or cloud services, which is pretty well equivalent to the world's entire airline industry. We get very exercised about flying, probably less exercised about how much data, how much energy and carbon is associated with data storage. But it is important to try and get hold of it. I do know things, for example, Microsoft's Azure service, they'll provide, if you're using that, they'll provide you with a very comprehensive report of the carbon associated with the data they handle on your behalf. You may not get a very comprehensive answer from other data centers or cloud service providers. They may not be able to give you the information, but it's worth asking the question. And it's just worth having, bearing in mind that is a contribution to your to your firm's carbon footprint. So if you can get the information, then great. And then anything, this is a bit of a sort of catch-all really. So anything else that isn't that you buy as a business that isn't included in that list. So an example of that would be, if you engaged somebody to run a conference for you, and the conference provider may be able to say, as a result of doing that, it's 5 tons of carbon because of the energy that we use, and et cetera, et cetera. So great if you can do that, and it's worth bearing in mind when you put together contracts for these services, just asking the question: are you able to give us an idea of carbon footprint it's going to be? And it may be, ideally, it will be part of your procurement consideration. I suspect for many organizations, many firms, it may be slightly lower down on the list than price and efficiency and timeliness, etc. But it is important. So if you can get hold of that information, then put it into that box there, and that will be included as part of the resources. So I've put 40 in there. That 40 will be added to all the carbon associated with this lot here. So once you've done that, you can breathe a sigh of relief that you've actually got through and you've entered data. It may take you several attempts. You may have to do this in several visits, and that's not a problem. As it should save it for you. I mean, I would just, for safety's sake, I would hit the save draft button there. But once you go off it, it should save it for you anyway automatically. But it's worth just pressing save draft if you know that the figures you want to revisit the figures. But if you're happy, then we'll press update calculation, and that will then take us to the footprint. So we have the footprint, which will show you each of those emission sources that we went through, that you entered data for. If you hover over it, it'll give you the tonnage or the tons of carbon. So oil we use very, very little. It'll give you the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for each of these. The table on the right-hand side will give you your total carbon in terms of tons of carbon, tons of CO2e. It'll give you the carbon per FTE, full-time equivalent, and also the carbon per square meter of floor space. Again, useful comparative metrics that you can use internally. And in due course, it may be something you can use to compare with other firms and other organizations. And obviously give you the sort of the general notes of how many offices you've included in this, what the headcount, etc. And then if you scroll down, it'll give you those broken down into the specific scopes, and you'll see that the colors here in the chart correspond to these colors. So it'll just give you a breakdown. If you want to have an understanding of how your scope 3, for example, compares with your scopes 1 and 2, that'll give you that information there, as well as an individual listing of the different carbon associated with each of those sources. Little pie chart. not particularly helpful other than just giving you a graphic to sort of say, well, 82% of our total carbon footprint is from our Scope 3 emissions. Again, traditionally, those are the most difficult ones to get hold of, because quite often we've got tallies, we've got manifests, we've got some sort of a bill which might be able to give us the information we need for Scope 1 and 2. Not quite so easy, and there's a lot more of these ones in Scope 3. So that's a whole different subject, effectively, or a whole different series of workshops in terms of looking at Scope 3. Again, that's something the LSA is looking at and running a series of workshops. So something I'm sure in due course it would be possible to link in and make sure that we've sort of shared the information. You'll see here, this is the location-based calculation, because we didn't check that box, and electricity is 37.46 tons. If we go back, just hoping this is all going to work for me, I'll go back to where we entered the data for electricity. If we check that box now, we say, yeah, it is actually, we are buying from a certified 100% renewable source. Again, coming back to the point about credits, if you're comfortable that it would be useful anyway to know what the result would be if you're saying that you're buying 100% renewable or it's 100% offset effectively. If we then go to the bottom and update the calculation, it should return 0 against electricity, which it does, and it then changes and tells you it's market-based. So in terms of reporting, it's useful to have the two charts side by side, your location-based and your market-based calculations. The FAQs, which very few people ever sort of look at, I certainly always forget FAQs and these, but there's a little FAQ there about what's the difference between location-based and market-based. Something about what do we mean by TCO2 if somebody asks you. The conversion factors, just highlighting the fact that that these are UK government with the exception of the electricity, which is US supplied electricity. The methodology we use, highlighted the greenhouse gas protocol. So if you wanted to refer to that, if you Google that, you can get hold of that. And there are various elements to that, various parts of that. And hopefully, and help obviously if you wanted to get help from colleagues within LSN. What I will do now, if I may quickly, I'm going to change. I'm going to show you the which is we've produced. So this is we are. So there's a PDF of a guide. So use the guide. It'll help you to just a reminder of what I've just really gone through. So it gives you the details about the login, what the tool does, and then a little bit of a reminder about what each of the different commands or menu options are, etc., etc. So I won't go through this all over again, but it's basically it's there if you need it, and it essentially tells you everything that I've pretty well gone through. So there's that, and there's also this tool. Again, I'm hoping that it's available on the website or will be made available to you. So if you have got, you've got a bill which how many MMBTUs are. So MMBTU, strangely, is the metric million British thermal units. It's very colonial, that British thermal units. But anyway, that's if you're familiar with using your energy consumption being reported in MMBTU, and you know that you've got a certain number, let's say 1,000 for the sake of argument, then it will, well, it's probably not very many, but anyway, oops, it'll give you, yeah, it's probably far too many. Anyway, the point is, whatever you put in here, it'll convert it into the equivalent kilowatt hours for both electricity, natural gas, fuel oil, also miles to kilometers. It's rounded to the whole number, so forgive me, because obviously a mile is 1.60934 kilometers. I know that off by heart, but it's rounded to the whole number just for convenience, because otherwise it starts to get a bit silly if you're trying to enter 2 decimal places of when it comes to things like kilometers. And obviously pounds and other imperial measurements into the metric equivalent. So hopefully that is useful. It is available as a sort of standalone, a standalone spreadsheet, as is the guide as a standalone PDF. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I'm conscious of we're getting close on the hour, and I don't want to take anybody beyond the time we've said we would do. I hope that's helpful. Are there any questions at all? I'm very happy to answer anything or try to answer them. What I would, I mean, sorry, if you, as whilst you're thinking, if you have got questions, do shout. But what I would say is just try and have a look at the calculator, enter data, enter anything you like. It doesn't have to be real data. Just have a go at it, and see what it's like. Work your way around it. See whether you think it's helpful. Um, there is only one, there's one login per firm. So if for example you wanted a colleague to have access to it as well, I'm afraid, well, this is probably not how things should be, but it's just the one login. So you'd have to share that login. And the reason for that is I think very sensible, because we don't want you to be in the situation where, unbeknownst to you, a colleague is entering data and is effectively, it's on the system and you weren't aware of it. And then you think, well, there's two sets of data here for the firm. So it's important that, there is only one set of data, therefore there's only one login. And it really, whoever's been given that has got control of it. And if you choose to share it, that's fine. It's up to you. But we can't provide sort of independent logins for different people within the same firm, if that makes sense. But as I said, have a look at it, try it out, I won't say try and break it, but use it as much as you can. If the things on it you think, well, this just doesn't make sense, or I'm not, this isn't relevant to your situation, or isn't helpful, or you think could be modified, then by all means get in touch with Mike, who will get in touch with us, and we'll do what we can. I can't promise that we'll make major changes, because this is based on the LSA's calculator. We have tailored it to suit, hopefully just to better suit your circumstances. But there is only a limit to how much we can do at this stage. But in due course, it may be that we can do some further modifications. So I hope that's helpful. And unless there are any other questions, as I said, do try and use the calculator. And get in touch with Mike if you've got any particular issues, or you've got any suggestions or thoughts, and I'm sure he would want to hear any feedback, and I'd be very happy to hear feedback. It's probably better for things to go through Mike rather than coming directly to me, but obviously he and I are in touch, as are my colleagues within the rest of the LSA. So I hope that's useful, and in that case, unless there's anything else, the recording of this will be made available, I think, on the LSN website. And I look forward to continue to support in whatever way we at the LSA can. So, and I hope everybody finds this helpful, and enjoy the rest of your day, I guess. So thanks very much indeed, and I'll say farewell.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay, then,
Appreciate
thanks a
it.
lot. Take care.